heart very complex. There's a lot of layers to it. Often the analogy people like to use is the human heart is like an onion, right? And you kind of take the layers off and there's more layers underneath. And there's always another layer, it feels like. But I think for me, a more accurate analogy, and actually analogies are always a little bit inaccurate just by their very nature. I kind of have a little love-hate relationship with analogies because I both love analogies because they can really make a point, but then it's very easy to nitpick them and kind of tear them apart, which is often what happens when you use an analogy in a discussion. But for the purposes of this service, I think the analogy of the Russian doll is a little bit kind of where I'm going with the service, right? Because, each doll actually can be painted unique. You take one off, you can put it back on, and you can make it kind of as intricate as you want. You can kind of make your own Russian doll and have as many layers as you want. And even at the very smallest layer, you can hide like a little gift or treasure or something at the very bottom, right? So I find that analogy much more kind of accurate to the idea that each layer of the human heart can be very different, right? And it's kind of very unique and can be built in its own way, right? Where an onion, it's all the same. Each layer is roughly the same, tastes the same, looks the same, right? Just slightly different sizes. So hence why I felt like changing the analogy a bit. But of course, the other reason I'm using the analogy of Russian doll is, as everyone's kind of aware, thinking a lot about the war in Ukraine and Russia. And so to me, it's kind of a good example of this idea of the human heart is very much interpreting what it sees, kind of based on its own experience and its own understanding of the world around it, right? So I don't want to talk too much about the war in Ukraine because I feel it's a very sensitive topic and could be quite actually, there's a lot of complexity there that people are speaking about without understanding. But more, I want to kind of highlight how everyone reacts to it very differently. And actually, I feel like the way people react to it is very much kind of the way they relate to it or the way it impacts them personally, right? And, for example, you can see what Russia's doing to Ukraine as, a bigger nation bullying a younger nation, right? And if you were ever kind of bullied by someone or taken advantage by someone with more power than you or more influence or more popularity, then that kind of brings up that feeling of injustice, right? And so you might be reacting to that feeling of injustice and that feeling of, this isn't really fair, this doesn't really make sense, right? Or it could be something much more personal where people who have experienced war, or who've been refugees, or who've experienced the kind of after effects. And, you don't want that for anyone. So when you see it, you feel kind of compassion and anger at the kind of needlessness of that kind of suffering, right? But then, there's also the idea that there's also wars going on in other places, right? That we don't react as strongly to, right? Our reaction to the war in Ukraine has been actually very strong and very kind of uniform across most Western countries. But there's also a war going on in Yemen, right? There's civil wars going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo almost constantly, right? And there's other areas of the world where there's kind of these constant conflicts, So why do we care more about one more than another? And these are just kind of questions I've been thinking about. But again, I don't want the sermon to be about the war in Ukraine, but I think it's a good example of, people's hearts react to things based on what their personal experiences, right? What they can relate to, what they can understand, so they see something And when it impacts them, they really react to it, right? And I think some of the reasons I mentioned is, why I react the way I do to the war in Ukraine, because I do feel that kind of injustice of stronger power taking advantage of a weaker country, right? I do worry because it's kind of the two biggest countries to go to war in a long time, right? And the impact of that on the world could be very disastrous. And also, the idea of needless suffering really bothers me. This was such an unnecessary type of battle, and war always causes a knock-on effect. It always causes suffering downstream to a lot of people, not just on the Ukrainian side, but because of the reactions, it's going to have a massive effect on people in Russia, and Russian people also suffer. So it's just it's a sad situation, but the sadness and the reaction people have is very from their heart and from their experience. And I think a very good example of this are people like, yeah, we should defend Ukraine, we should help Ukraine. And so Ukraine said, you're welcome to come and fight with us, right? And people go, well, not that much. I'm not ready to drop everything and fly over to Ukraine and fight for them. But, I care, right? Well, then how much do you care, right? So it's something to think about, right? It's kind of this, why do we care? And how much do we really care, right? And what are we actually willing to do other than to maybe post on Facebook, a Ukrainian flag and donate some money and say it's really sad and unfortunate, right? And that's not actually a criticism, because what can you do, right? It's very easy to feel helpless, but I give it as an example because it's a very good example of this kind of Russian doll effect that I'm talking about with the human heart, right? There are layers in there that kind of open up when this kind of story comes up. And, maybe it's 3 layers down or 4 layers down that this really bothers you and it impacts you, right? But ultimately, the purpose of the human heart is to feel God's love, right? That's why our hearts were created, right? If you think back to the pure original purpose of humanity, it's to feel this pure, complete, unconditional love of a parent, completely secure, completely protected. So in one way, it's a good structure. And, I hate making my analogy the core of my whole sermon, but the idea is that, each level is kind of built up one by one. So, first when you're a baby, you have your kind of baby heart that's taken care of and loved. And then you grow and you build like a slightly bigger Russian doll on that basis, right? You can kind of build them out. And then in the end, you have actually many unique, beautiful layers that when you meet another person, you really want to move through those levels with them, right? You want to sit down and, you start at the surface level and you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And ultimately, that's what people really want, is you meet someone and you start to learn all their different history and all the different levels their heart has gone through, grown through, and developed through. And that's actually a beautiful experience, right? And I remember when I was young, one of the nicest things to do was to just sit down and talk with someone you've met, maybe 4 hours, 5 hours. You just stay up all night chatting about life and all your different views about everything and all the different things you like, and make jokes about whatever, and then talk about the future. Like it's a beautiful experience to connect with people and start to really feel their heart and also be able to share your heart. But the reality is that our hearts are not that easy to share, right? They're kind of cracked and glued together, and and when you open them up, some of them are really badly painted and a bit ugly, right? So it's very hard to actually open up each layer of your heart, right? And we know that. We know, like, when we meet new people, you kind of really stay at the surface level, right? And you really kind of test and prod and are careful before you check underneath the surface, right? Or let someone else check underneath your surface, right? Because you don't want more cracks. You don't want, they're very fragile the way they've been built in our lives, right? So there's a really clear paradox here about the human heart. And we have to really get used to paradoxes in order to really understand how to grow our hearts and how to get past this self-consciousness and the sensitivity about sharing this heart. And I wanted to give a little bit of a summary of this lecture I heard. It was actually originally an article, and the author kind of gave a lecture about it and explained it in more detail. And I'd suggest people kind of look it up. It's kind of a bit humorous but serious, and it's called "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person." Right? Very clickbaity title, but I think it's something we would actually agree with in our community and church, because it's kind of our argument is you shouldn't try to find the person yourself because you'll mess it up. So you should you should follow this more arranged process so that God can find the right person instead of you, right? So I wasn't immediately put off by that kind of title. And then what the guy was explaining, he's kind of a philosopher, psychologist, is that when people start to live together, when people get very close, one of the hardest parts about marriage and a relationship is this massive contradiction that when you need to be the most vulnerable, when you really need to open up and have someone help you, is when you close up the tightest, right? It's the thing that, because it's the most sensitive, it's the part of you that you actually need help. It's the part of you that you need to tell somebody, you need to share, especially with someone that you trust, and especially someone who can hear it, but you don't. And instead, the natural human reaction is to shut it down, right? And so this is a constant paradox with most people, is it's the very thing they need to do. It is also the very reason they can't do it, right? Because it's so sensitive, because it's so deep down in the Russian dolls, it's the most protected, right? And so that's just a paradox in relationships. When you meet with people, when you talk to people, you get to this point where you kind of need to share something, but you can't, right? And that's the paradox there. And there's a similar paradox, and that's kind of the sharing your heart between others, right? And I guess one way to explain it is some of that healing you need someone else to do, right? But in order to allow them to do it, they need to see the cracks, right? Because how are they going to fix it without seeing it, right? And then the other paradox is in your own self, right? Because you need to be able to kind of look at your own heart and understand it, and really kind of, you want to patch up as much of it as you can so that it is easier to share with others, right? But again, the instinct is to not face that, because it's sore, it hurts, it can be painful. And so there's just this kind of natural human instinct to distract ourselves from ourselves, right? And so, especially in the modern world, there's plenty of distractions, right? On your phone, you can be distracted for as long as you want until the battery runs out, and you can plug it in and keep being distracted while you're lying in bed and it's charging, right? It's basically an unlimited supply of distractions, right? So you can go your whole life with, always, watching funny videos or reading something or being on social media or playing a game, right? And that's what a lot of people do. They just kind of avoid the time to stop and to reflect and to really see themselves, kind of beginning to end, take out each part of their heart and look at it and understand it and evaluate it. So, so this is what this psychologist philosopher was saying, right? This idea that the paradox is we don't look at ourselves, so we can't see how annoying we are to live with, right? So then we don't understand when someone else is annoyed by us, because we don't understand ourselves, what's annoying about ourselves. That human beings are all a mixed bag of kind of good, bad, and ugly. And it's the ugly parts that are really hard for us to look at in ourselves. So in the same way, there's this paradox. And I just felt this really lined up when I was listening to this. It really lines up with the introduction of the principle, right? This idea of us being in contradiction, this idea of us having good and bad, and really hard for us to resolve those two parts of ourselves. So I was really thinking about, especially when this person was talking about the inability to look at ourselves. And, I kind of thought, well, when do I look at myself then? How does that look like? And to me, it was really obvious. Well, I do that the most when I'm praying, when I'm trying to pray. I'm coming before God and I'm asking God for something. And so it's really a humbling experience. I really try to humble myself and ask myself, why would God want to answer this prayer, right? And even, with Father's explanation of prayer being more a report, right? Because it's not like us begging for something, but more us having a conversation, us telling a parent about our day and our life. Then I think, am I kind of, what kind of person am I to give this report? So prayer is a really powerful tool for this type of self-reflection. I can really see from this perspective of understanding our own hearts how important prayer is, how important it is to kind of reflect. And, it's such an important tool for kind of self-reflection and kind of self-awareness. And that's also true for meditation. It's true for kind of other ways to do this. But, I've tried to meditate and I just get distracted, just space out or, fall asleep actually is the most common thing when I try to meditate. But when I pray, it's really an exercise in self-reflection and trying to understand. Like I'm praying because I really want to understand what I should be doing, what my purpose is, what my value is, what God wants me to do. So, and it's the same for other things like that, when you do reflections at the beginning of the year or the end of the year, I feel like those are powerful tools where I can actually be with myself, right? And I've said many times, like, people can say they're happy when they're distracted, right? They can say that they're a certain way. But how are you when you just remove all distractions and you're just alone and you're by yourself and you're just with yourself? How do you feel? And are you honest with yourself about where you're at, right? And I think it's a very important skill because we want to grow. We don't just want to survive, we want to grow. And we just can't grow without that step of self-awareness and self-understanding. So, another example of this is, one thing that I used to always do is when I was walking to work, there's a great opportunity to not exactly pray, but just kind of, especially on nice days, thank God for the day and just kind of, I try to make a habit when I was walking to work to ask God, what do you want me to do today? What would be, what things should I be worried about? What things should I be thinking about? And, how should I try to interact with people? What matters today, right? And, then I would start thinking about a lot of things, but it would be a very focused kind of, even though I'm walking and I'm kind of focused on getting to work as fast as possible, I could think about much deeper things, right? It's almost like when you have a shower and you just have shower thoughts, right? Because you're alone and you're not distracted and you can really, really think about something very deeply and not be distracted. But I noticed like a lot of people now when they're going to work or they're commuting or they're on a bicycle or they just got headphones on, right? So they're like listening to a podcast or listening to music. And in many ways, it's unfortunate. It's like another type of distraction, right? So that they have that time to think and then they're not really using it. And, I listen to podcasts on the bus or whatever, but I just feel it's so important to have some time every day, right? Where you're just looking at yourself and asking yourself, am I really where I want to be, right? What can I do next? What's the next step? How can I grow? Where's these little ugly parts of me? Or where are these little not so good parts of me? And what do I do with them, right? And how do I kind of start to patch them up? And it's kind of the there's all these contradictions around, right? It's kind of the idea, I always thought it was a bit of a contradiction about the principle's explanation of reaching maturity, right? The first blessing and the second blessing, because the first blessing is to be mature and to reach perfection and communion with God. But technically, that's not really possible till you accomplish the second blessing, right? Because you need an object partner in order to really understand God's heart, because God is masculine and feminine. So you can't be perfect without being in a relationship, but you can't be in a relationship without being perfect. There's a little bit of a contradiction, right? But obviously it's not, it's never that black and white. It's like there are steps, incremental growth and process, right? So, but there's always these contradictions between people, right? Where you really want to understand someone. You really want to connect with someone on a deep level. But you also want to hide in the middle of that process the parts that they want to connect with you, right? And a lot of this is subconscious, right? And that's why it creates all these contradictions. So there's the contradictions between people, and then there's the contradictions even within ourselves, right? And it's, to me, this is the process of restoration. This is kind of what restoration means when I think about it. It's these moments, right? These little opportunities, let's say, right? To start to patch up or rebuild these Russian dolls, to really, find in a person their core heart, right? Which I kind of imagine as like a little golden ball, the last Russian doll. When you get through them all, you get the prize, and that's their real heart, right? That's their real essence, right? Huh? You're lucky if you're golden ball. Yeah. Well, that's the thing, I genuinely believe that's that analogy, that gold ball at the very bottom, is the part that makes people unique, right? It's the part that even God, and maybe this is, heretical or controversial, but I feel like even God doesn't control that gold ball or fully know, right? That's what is each person's own completely unique character. And that was the risk God took when he created human beings, was to give them that something that was completely their own, that he had no control over, right? And so because of that, I believe actually God doesn't know what people will do. Like he has maybe 20, 100, 1,000 possibilities, but he never knows for sure what each person will do, right? So my final point, the final point I'm getting to is we all want to love completely, right? We want to be able to meet someone and love them top to bottom, inside out, every part, because we also want to be loved that way, right? This is completely natural in the way the world should be. But when we try, we hit these like really tangled knots. And they're very hard to untie, right? They're very hard to kind of just start separating and untying. And, when I think about my own life, when I do sit and reflect on, the life I've lived, and, I'm very grateful because I don't have a lot of trauma, a lot of resentment, a lot of tragedy. I know I'm very lucky not to have been hurt too deeply or to have experienced things that, really hurt deep down. And so I feel like, lucky for that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that I can be perfectly happy. It doesn't mean that I have no problems, right? There's still enough sadness in the world that, people that I, even with just one step away from me, are really unhappy. And it's really hard for me then to help them or even to know how to help them, right? So yeah, we all want to love completely and we can't. And that's the ultimate contradiction, right? Is that I would love to, maybe put 3 hours aside. Me and James could go sit down, no one else around. We could ugly cry it out for a couple hours and really, really know each other and understand each other. Huh? What? even before we do it. That's good. Maybe that's a little knot coming untied, right? But that might not be enough, right? I don't know if 3 hours could cover all James's issues or all my issues. But the point is like that's a commitment. That's hard to do, and to do that with every person we know is emotionally draining, right? We don't have the strength for it sometimes, right? So it's what we want. It's how we grow. It's how we restore things. And I don't actually have the answer to that. Only that I really feel that's the best way I can explain it, right? Is that we try and then we hit this knot and the knot is too hard to untangle. And so then we stop trying. And I feel like that knot is what we actually have to do the most. When we find those knots, that's the most important thing in each of our relationships. We have to figure out a way to resolve that contradiction, right? And that's what I'm praying about and trying to figure out how to do. And I don't think I have the answer, but I think that's what it takes to change the world, is to hit those knots and to keep coming back to them and not to run away from them, but to start to untie them. And there's a lot, and it'll take a long time, but I think each knot we untie really deepens our level of love and really deepens our ability then to be loved and to love. So hopefully then we can find the heart within. And that's my service for today. So thank you, everyone. And I'll close with a prayer. Sarai Manashin Hanal Bumonim. Our dear, beloved, and precious Heavenly Parent. There's so much going on in the world that we are either unaware of or that we're aware of, but only in a very conceptual way, especially around human suffering. Of course, in the media now, the war in Ukraine is kind of front and center. And it's really impacting people because it's something that is somehow easier for them to relate to. But at the end of the day, the cost in terms of human suffering is something that we don't understand and we can't fully grasp. It's just as true in Ukraine as in Yemen and in other parts of the world where there's still constant suffering and abuse. So just today, I'd really like to pray for those who are suffering the most, wherever they may be, those who feel hopeless and don't know where they can go. I just pray that their hearts can be comforted and they can find some hope to grab onto. That spirit world and the providence can reach them and start to bring them out of whatever tragedy and difficult time that they are in. And in the meantime, I pray that we, as followers of true parents, as people fighting to live up to the standard of the principle, can each day learn to become stronger, more capable in our ability to love, more capable in our ability to influence the direction of this world and of the players in this world. We know Mother is really able to interact with the top level of politics and economics and media, and pray that those interactions can really start to bear fruit on the world stage, especially when there are the type of challenges we see today. So in closing, I pray for each of our brothers and sisters that each of them can, throughout this week, feel your love more deeply, more personally. And it can really give them hope and inspiration and direction. And just grateful for all of us here, grateful for all the opportunities we have, all the blessings we have, the fact that we have this life to live, to enjoy. And I report these things in our names, in the name of Youngil and Vicky Loew, Blessed Central Family.